Good morning, Europe. It's Thursday, the 10th of February. A very warm welcome to the programme. Let's begin by looking at our top stories.
Russia and Belarus prepare for joint military drills close to Ukraine's border, while a new round of diplomatic talks gets underway today in Berlin. At the Winter Olympics in Beijing, a figure skating gold medal is on hold after an athlete tests positive for a banned substance.
A Belarusian cross-country skier has fled to Poland with her family amid the widespread crackdown against the country's opposition.
Russia and Belarus begin 10 days of joint military drills today in a ratcheting up of tensions on Ukraine's border. Russia now has 30,000 troops, 2 battalions of S-400 surface-to-air missile systems, and numerous fighter jets in Belarus. The effect stretches Ukrainian troops and has prompted Kiev into holding its own military drills. The manoeuvres come as Western leaders continue diplomatic efforts to de-escalate the situation. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is involved in the current flurry of diplomatic activity. Speaking alongside Denmark's Prime Minister, he claims there are signs of progress in helping to stop Russia from invading Ukraine.
Of course, there remain serious points of difference in how we see things during these discussions, but there are discussions. The OSCE has likewise become again a platform for exchange on security in Europe, which we always stressed, and this is progress.
Scholz will travel to Kiev and then Moscow next week for his first face-to-face meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Britain's Foreign Secretary Liz Truss has arrived in Moscow for a 2-day visit for talks with her counterpart Sergei Lavrov. And the UK's Prime Minister Boris Johnson will be in Poland for continuing diplomacy discussions. Last month, Russia announced it was staging various drills on land and at sea. Moscow continues to deny it intends to invade Ukraine, but insists its security concerns over NATO expansion must be addressed by the West.
Well, a rare bit of optimism, a little bit of optimism at least, coming from the German capital Berlin. Olaf Scholz has said that the strategy currently taking place in order to deal with Russia's buildup of troops along the Ukrainian border, well, it seems to be somewhat working, at least for the moment, he said. And he's talking about a dual strategy. Diplomacy, on one hand, something that the German Chancellor himself have become more and more involved with over the last few weeks. And on the other hand, the more pressure side of things, putting pressure on Russia, talking about sanctions that will be very severe if the country does attack Ukraine, and also sending arms to Ukraine, something that other NATO members, rather than Germany, have done. This diplomatic part of this strategy will continue here in Berlin. Olaf Scholz will be holding meetings with the 3 leaders of the Baltic states, and also a crucial meeting is supposed to take place here in Berlin. It will put Russia and Ukraine in the same room together with France and Germany in the so-called Normandy format meeting. This will be a lower level meeting, certainly not the leaders or secretaries or ministers taking place, but lower level diplomats. But at the same time, it is still crucial, and it comes 2 weeks after the same type of meeting happened in Paris. And the hope is that this Normandy format will also be a way to find a diplomatic solution to this crisis. Jonah Calgren, Euronews, Berlin.
Offer Friedman is a senior lecturer in war studies at King's College London and author of the book Russian Hybrid Warfare. He told Euronews how he sees Russia's current military and diplomatic strategies.
The Kremlin created this military buildup to ignite, shape, shift, and generally facilitate the diplomatic discussions intended to address Moscow's security concerns, which, by the way, have been largely ignored by the West for decades. Assuming that Moscow has no appetite for full-scale invasion and occupation of Ukraine, and assuming that Moscow will not simply send troops back empty-handed, it has 4 main options. First is limited kinetic operation against the Ukrainian military assets and infrastructure. Second option is a limited kinetic operation against NATO assets in Ukraine, however small they are. Third option is a combination of these two. And fourth option, which generally ignored, is maintaining the current military buildup without further kinetic actions, as the Kremlin promises so far. I believe the current situation on the Ukrainian border was created to initiate diplomatic dialogue and not kinetic operation. However, if the Kremlin will estimate that a limited military operation will accelerate this dialogue in the right direction, then a limited kinetic operation is still an option.
As UK's Prime Minister Boris Johnson heads for Poland for diplomacy talks with NATO allies over the Ukraine-Russia crisis, at home, pressure continues to mount. It follows the release of a picture that appears to show Mr Johnson at a party in Downing Street in December 2020. The news of the leaked image to the media broke during Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday. Some MPs renewed their calls for Johnson to resign. It comes as an ongoing investigation into the alleged parties continues. Our reporter Ty Genwright says pictures of other lockdown parties could prove even more harmful.
Boris Johnson trying his best to move the political agenda on from the party scandal, talking about some ambitious new policies, even the relaxation of COVID measures. Even the opposition's questions were certainly more focused on wider, a variety of more general, shall we say, issues of the day. I think, though, many in the House simply weren't aware of this photo because it was only published while Prime Minister's questions was underway. So when we heard about it late in the session, when a backbench MP raised it, you can imagine the furious Googling which went underway among individuals, myself included, to see what we were talking about. The Prime Minister, though, appears not to have been taken by surprise by it. It's hard to imagine that the newspaper which published it, the Daily Mirror, wouldn't have asked his office about it ahead of time. He was able to speak with authority that it was something that the police already knew about. As bombshells go, it could be argued it wasn't that enormous because it was a party that we did already know about. We were told at the beginning, though, that police had decided it wasn't among those which met the bar for a criminal investigation, although we have now been told that's changed and the police are reviewing that decision. But it's also a reminder that there are hundreds of photos, we're told, of all these different parties in the hands of investigators, both the civil service and the police. And in the fullness of time, it is quite probable that we'll get to see more of them. And in the words of Boris Johnson's former advisor turned adversary, Dominic Cummings, some of the other photos are potentially far more damaging.
A move by the government of the Czech Republic to ease COVID restrictions has been widely welcomed. A certificate proving vaccination or natural immunity from a dose of the virus will no longer be needed to access restaurants and gyms.
I work in a, cafeteria just up the square. And it's just really annoying to ask everybody for a COVID pass when they come in. So I'm actually pretty happy that it's the government got rid of it.
I believe, that all those restrictions were not right. So we are coming to something that is normal.
While several nations are either lifting restrictions or thinking about it, the WHO has launched a plan by which poorly vaccinated, low and middle income nations can obtain tests, treatments and vaccines.
As outlined in the financing framework we're launching today, the ACT Accelerator requires $23 billion to save lives, address the threat of Omicron, and prevent even more dangerous variants emerging.
Romania is one of the countries where the fight against COVID remains an uphill struggle. The ambulance service in Bucharest is overwhelmed by COVID emergency calls. It's barely managing to respond to the demand as a fifth surge of COVID-19 brings a record number of cases. And in China, there's a reminder of the varying methods of fighting COVID. Only 180 cases have been reported in the southern city of Baise, but which has become the latest place to be fully locked down under China's zero-tolerance approach to the pandemic.
Canadian protesters occupying the centre of the country's capital, Ottawa, to oppose COVID-19 restrictions have directed their anger at Liberal Prime Minister Justin Trudeau after he called the so-called Freedom Convoy demonstration unacceptable.
And I never have been for Justin Trudeau since the beginning he came in, and I just want Justin, if you watch this, I want you to leave the office. I want you to leave completely.
But Trudeau is standing firm against the easing of the country's COVID restrictions in the face of mounting pressure from the protesters using trucks to blockade the city and vital U.S. border crossings.
You cannot stop a pandemic with blockades. You cannot end a pandemic by decree. You can't end a pandemic by legislation. You need to end a pandemic by relying on science, by public health measures, and by vaccinations. That's exactly what we have focused on through these past 2 years.
However, the blockade of the U.S. border crossings is beginning to have an economic impact, forcing the shutdown of a Ford car plant in Windsor due to delivery interruptions of auto parts.